So I want you to just close your eyes for a second. Picture this scene. It is October 11th, 1973. We're in Mississippi, right along the banks of the Pascagoula River.
Oh, yeah. The deep south, it's humid, the air is just thick.
Exactly. The sun has gone down, and the only light is really coming from the stars and maybe a little bit of distant glow from the city. It's completely quiet. You just hear the water lapping against the old, rotting wood of this pier.
It really is the kind of setting that feels like it's just waiting for a story to happen.
It really is. And in this setting, we find two men. You've got Charles Hickson, he's 42, a foreman at the local shipyard, a very solid guy, a family man. And with him is Calvin Parker, this 19-year-old kid who Charles has sort of taken under his wing.
Right, they work together.
Yeah, they've just finished a really grueling day of work at the shipyard, and they decide to go fishing. They're just looking to unwind, maybe catch a few fish for dinner, just decompress. It is the absolute definition of mundane.
And I think that mundanity is actually crucial to what happens next.
Yeah.
Because if you're going to invent a story, you usually set the stage with a bit more drama. But here, they were literally just killing time.
Right.
They were actually about to pack up and leave because the fish weren't biting. If they had reeled in their lines, maybe 5 minutes earlier, they would have just driven home, had dinner, and lived completely normal, obscure lives.
But they didn't leave. And instead of a quiet night, they walked right into what is arguably one of the most credible, most scrutinized, and frankly, most terrifying close encounters in American history. And I use the word credible very intentionally here.
You really have to. I mean, when we talk about UFOs, we usually deal with blurry photos or anonymous reports. This case, the Pascagoula abduction, is in a completely different league.
It really is.
We aren't just talking about a spooky ghost story. We're talking about a case with police interrogation takes, actual physical evidence, radiation checks, and a chain of custody that has frustrated skeptics for over 50 years.
And that is exactly the mission for this deep dive today. We are going to look past the sensational headlines and really get into the weeds of the source data. We want to understand why J. Allen Hynek, the guy who literally wrote the book on scientific ufology, flew down there and eventually called this case impossible to dismiss.
So let's go back to the pier. Charles and Calvin are just sitting there. It's dark. And then the atmosphere shifts. And it wasn't a slow build at all. It was immediate.
Right, the inciting incident. It starts with a sound. Charles described it as a zipping noise.
Which is a very specific detail. If you think about it, he didn't say it sounded like a jet engine or a low hum. He compared it to steam escaping a pipe under pressure.
Yeah.
It's a very mechanical, industrial sound.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense for a shipyard worker to use that specific comparison.
So they turn around, probably expecting to see a police car or maybe an accident at the yard, but instead they are hit with these two blinding blue pulsating lights. And behind the lights, there's a craft. Now, usually in these stories, we hear about a classic flying saucer. But this wasn't a saucer, was it?
No, not at all. The descriptions in the sources talk about an oval or cigar-shaped object, roughly 30 to 40 feet long, maybe 8 to 10 feet high. And here is a detail I always found fascinating. The lights weren't just glowing. They were revolving in a counterclockwise motion, and the craft was just hovering a few feet off the ground.
Okay, so you have this craft hovering in the grass right behind you. In 99% of UFO stories, the ship just takes off, and you have what we call a sighting. But in Pascagoula, a door opens. And what comes out, well, let's just say these aren't your typical Hollywood casting call aliens.
Not even close. If you look at the sketches provided in the police files, these things are pure nightmare fuel. They are completely unlike the standard pop culture gray alien with the big black eyes.
Let's really paint the picture for the listener here based on the files. 3 creatures float out. And when I say float, I mean they are literally hovering just above the ground. They're about 5 feet tall.
But they looked unfinished. I think that's the best word for it. Their skin was gray and intensely wrinkled. The sources compare it to an elephant's hide or a mummy that had been wrapped way too tight.
Yeah, and the anatomy was all wrong. They didn't have necks. The head just sat directly on the shoulders.
Right, and where you would normally expect a face, you had practically nothing. Where the nose and ears should be, they just had these pointed protrusions. Charles actually described them as looking like carrots sticking out of the head.
Which is such a bizarre detail to invent.
Exactly. And the mouth wasn't a mouth. It was just a horizontal slit. It didn't move. It didn't open. It didn't appear to breathe.
It's the limbs that really freak me out, though. The reports say they had these incredibly long arms, but they didn't have hands.
No hands at all. Charles called them claw-like or mitten-like. Some of the reports even compared them to crab claws. And the legs were even stranger. They appeared to be fused or welded together. They didn't walk, they glided.
Which perfectly leads to Charles Hickson's immediate theory right there on the riverbank. He didn't think they were animals or people. He thought they were robots.
And that theory really fits the movement. He described them as jerky and mechanical. When they turned, the entire body turned in unison. There was no fluidity at all. They didn't hesitate or look around. They came out of that craft and moved with a terrifyingly specific purpose. They came straight for the men.
So this is the capture phase. 3 of these wrinkled robots glide out. 2 of them grab Charlie, and 1 grabs the teenager, Calvin. Now, pause right here. If a robot crab monster grabs me, I am fighting, I am kicking, I am screaming, I am running for my life. Why didn't they?
They physically couldn't. This is a very consistent detail in the data. The moment the beings touched them, the men experienced total paralysis. Charlie said he felt a sharp prick or scratch on his arm, almost like a needle, and then instantly, just nothing. He could see, he could think, he was fully conscious of the absolute horror of the situation, but his body was dead weight. He described a strange sensation of weightlessness.
So they have floated up into the craft. And this is where the story gets really interesting for me, because the narrative actually splits. Usually if 2 guys are making up a story, they agree on a script, right? Like, we went into the ship, the captain talked to us, gave us a message of peace, and we left. But here, they were separated.
That's a crucial distinction to make. Separation prevents collaboration on the story. Charles Hickson was taken into a room filled with brilliant, blinding light. He's suspended in midair, no table, just floating. And he describes an examination that feels completely impersonal.
Yeah, he mentioned a giant eye.
Right, an instrument that looked like a large eye detached from the wall and just floated toward him. It scanned his body, moving back and forth, up and down. He felt like a specimen on a conveyor belt. He said he heard a low mumbling sound, perhaps communication between the entities, but they never once acknowledged him as a conscious being. To them, he was just biology to be cataloged.
Which completely reinforces the robot theory. It was cold and clinical. But Calvin, the 19-year-old, his experience was completely different. It sounds much more invasive.
Calvin's experience was traumatic on a completely different level. He was taken to a different area of the craft. And he didn't just see the wrinkled robots. He actually reported seeing a female entity.
A female? How could he even tell?
Well, he described her as smaller, more humanoid, with large almond eyes, features that actually aligned a bit more with what we later call the Greys. But she wasn't just standing there. She physically handled him. She pinched his cheeks, checked his muscle density. And then the sources describe a medical examination that makes you wince just reading about it.
Yeah, this part of the source material is pretty rough.
She inserted fingers or probes down his throat and then up into his nasal cavity. It was visceral. It was essentially an assault.
And the terrifying juxtaposition here is that while she is physically hurting him, she is communicating telepathically.
Yes. Calvin reported hearing a voice in his head saying, "Don't be afraid, we aren't going to hurt you."
Which is just gaslighting at an interstellar level. I'm shoving a probe into your sinus cavity, but relax, we're friends.
Essentially, yes. And the psychological impact on a 19-year-old kid is hard to overstate. He actually passed out from the fear initially, woke up during the exam, and was just completely overwhelmed.
How long did this whole thing last?
Subjectively, it probably felt like a lifetime to them. In reality, they estimated they were on board for about 20 to 30 minutes. Suddenly, the exam just stops. They are floated back out and deposited right back on the riverbank.
And the exit is just as abrupt as the entrance. Calvin is standing there, his arms held out, basically catatonic. Charlie hits the ground, his knees buckle, and he just collapses. They look up, and the craft shoots straight up. Charlie's quote from the sources is actually quite poetic. He said it was like a falling star in reverse.
And just like that, they are alone in the dark again. Silence returns to the shipyard.
This is the exact moment where our deep dive shifts from the story itself to the evidence. Because if I'm in their shoes, sitting in the dark, I'm thinking, no one is ever going to believe us. We need to shut up. We need to never speak of this again.
And that was exactly their very first conversation. They sat in their car for 45 minutes, just shaking. They heavily debated, never telling a single soul. They actually drove to a gas station. They got a soda. And it admittedly took a shot of whiskey to calm their nerves.
Right.
That detail is important because skeptics later really latched onto the alcohol aspect. But you have to remember, the drinking happened after the trauma, strictly as a coping mechanism.
But the internal pressure was just too much for them. They felt a moral obligation. Charlie specifically felt that if these things were a threat to the country, they had to tell someone in charge. So they go to the Jackson County Sheriff's Office.
Enter Sheriff Fred Diamond.
Yeah.
Now, you have to put yourself in his shoes for a minute. He's a no-nonsense lawman in Mississippi. Two guys walk in, smelling faintly of whiskey, looking completely disheveled, talking about wrinkled robots and flashing blue lights. He naturally assumes it's a prank, or they're drunk, or maybe it's a cover for something illegal they were doing at the shipyard.
So he interrogates them. He really grills them.
For hours. He tries his best to trip them up. He separates them, asks the exact same questions out of order. But their stories stay completely consistent. However, the sheriff still has that lingering doubt. He thinks, okay, they're sticking to the script while I'm in the room, but let's see what happens when the audience leaves.
And this leads us to the secret tape. In my opinion, this is the smoking gun of the entire case. If you take nothing else away from this deep dive today, you have to remember the secret tape.
It really is the piece of evidence that is the hardest to debunk. Sheriff Diamond puts Charlie and Calvin in an interrogation room together. He turns on a hidden tape recorder he had in a desk drawer. He walks out, turns off the lights, and just leaves them alone. He fully expects to hear them laugh. He expects to hear something like, "Man, did you see his face?" Or, "Make sure you tell him the robot had claws."
But that's not what he hears at all.
No. The tape captures pure, unadulterated terror. You can hear Charlie Hickson pacing the floor. Keep in mind, he's a Korean War combat veteran, a man who knows exactly what real fear is.
Yeah.
And on the tape, he says, "I thought I'd been through enough hell on this earth." He sounds completely broken.
And Calvin, the young kid, sounds even worse.
Calvin is practically hyperventilating. You can hear the raw distress in his voice. He says, "I'm going to go crazy, Charlie. I can't stand it." He's talking about his arms being frozen.
Yeah.
And this is the real kicker, he starts praying. He is literally praying to God for salvation.
That's the thing that gets me every single time I review this case. If you are hoaxing a sheriff just to get your name in the local paper, you do not sit in a dark room and weep and pray to God when you think no one is listening.
Exactly. That tape absolutely destroyed the sheriff's skepticism.
Yep.
When he played it back, he realized whatever these men saw, they believe it. They aren't lying. They are genuinely traumatized.
So once the sheriff was on board, the floodgates kind of opened. The military gets involved pretty quickly, right?
Yes, they do. The very next day, they were taken to Keesler Air Force Base. The military's concern wasn't just aliens, it was radiation. If that craft was nuclear-powered, these men were walking biological hazards. A team swabbed their bodies, their clothes, even scraped their fingernails.
And the results of that?
Negative for radiation. However, they did find physical marks. Charlie had puncture wounds on his arm, perfectly aligning with the sharp prick he felt. Calvin had a strange mark on his foot. The fact that the Air Force took it seriously enough to run a full decontamination protocol really tells you the authorities were rattled by this.
And then the heavy hitters of the scientific community show up. We're talking about Dr. J. Allen Hynek and Dr. James Harder. For the listener who maybe doesn't know the deep lore, who are these guys?
Hynek was the official scientific advisor to Project Blue Book, which was the Air Force's official UFO study program. He actually started his career as a supreme skeptic.
Yeah.
He's the famous swamp gas guy. But by 1973, he was realizing there was something genuinely real here. Dr. Harder was a professor of engineering at Berkeley and a consultant for the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization. These were highly credible academics, not fringe theorists.
And they decide to put the men under hypnosis. Now, I know hypnosis is quite controversial today as a method for retrieving memories, but in the 70s, it was really considered the gold standard.
It was. And what's compelling isn't just the specific story they told under hypnosis, but their physical reaction to the regression. When Dr. Harder regressed them back to the exact moment of capture, they didn't just talk about it. They engaged the sympathetic nervous system. They were sweating profusely, shaking uncontrollably, their heart rate spiked. They were reliving the trauma in real time. Dr. Harder stated unequivocally that a physiological reaction that severe could not be faked by two ordinary guys.
Charlie even took a lie detector test to prove it, didn't he?
He did. And the polygraph examiner was so incredibly skeptical of this story that he actually ran the test 3 separate times, just trying to find a baseline for deception. Charlie passed every single time. The machine indicated he was being completely truthful about what he believed he saw.
I want to zoom out for a second here. Often we hear these stories and think, wow, what an isolated, weird night in Mississippi. But was it just one weird night?
No, it wasn't. And this is what researchers call a flap. A flap is a concentrated period of high UFO activity in a very specific geographic region. 1973 Mississippi was a massive hotbed. On the very night of the abduction, October 11th, the police received over 50 calls from different citizens reporting strange lights in the sky.
50 calls in one night.
50 calls. And some of those independent witnesses even described the exact same blue pulsating light that Charlie and Calvin saw. Even the local police weren't immune to it. A police chief, Hubert Roberts, reported a disc-like craft hovering over a patrol car just a year later. So you really have to view the Pascagoula event not as an isolated anomaly, but as the absolute peak of a massive wave of activity in that area.
That outside corroboration really makes the mass hallucination theory fall apart pretty quickly. Speaking of theories, the skeptics obviously did try to attack this case over the years. What was their best shot?
The primary skeptical theory, aside from the hoax angle, which the secret tape largely dismantles, is something called a hypnagogic hallucination.
Can you break that down for us?
Sure, it's a recognized state of consciousness right between waking and sleeping. People in this state often experience sleep paralysis. They hear loud buzzing sounds, they feel a heavy weight on their chest, or a menacing presence in the room with them. Historically, this is exactly where stories of the old hag or midnight demons come from.
The buzzing sound and the physical paralysis match Charlie's story perfectly, to be fair.
They do match, but here is the fatal flaw in applying that theory to Pascagoula. Hypnagogic hallucinations happen to individuals, almost always when they are lying in bed. It is statistically almost impossible for two people standing up, actively fishing, wide awake, to enter a shared hallucination at the exact same second and hallucinate the exact same bizarre details.
Right.
That is what psychiatry calls folie à deux, or shared madness. But folie à deux usually develops over months or years of intense isolation, not in a split second on a river pier.
It just doesn't fit the facts on the ground. And didn't the famous debunker Philip Klass try to tear their story down?
Klass was the arch nemesis of UFO believers back then. He dug deeply into their finances, their backgrounds, looking for literally any reason they would lie for profit. He found absolutely nothing. No massive hidden debts, no history of fraud. The only thing he could cling to was the fact that they had that one drink after the event. He tried to frame them as just a couple of drunks, but the timeline just didn't fit his narrative.
There was also a really strange theory about a Soviet submarine, right? I remember reading about that in the sources.
Oh, the USO theory, unidentified submersible object. The idea was that maybe a highly advanced Soviet mini-sub surfaced in the river to spy on the shipyard. But that falls apart instantly upon review. A submarine doesn't float 30 feet in the air above the grass. A sub doesn't deploy floating robots with carrot noses and claw hands that glide through walls. It was just people desperately grasping for any explanation that wasn't aliens.
So let's talk about the human cost of all this. Because in the movies, the aliens leave, the ship flies away, and the credits roll. In real life, these two guys had to go back to work the next week. They had to live with us forever.
And they handled the aftermath in completely opposite ways. It really highlights their generational difference. Charlie Hickson, the older foreman, became what we might call a torchbearer. He decided that if this happened, it had to mean something important. He wrote a book. He went on the talk show circuit. He flat out refused to be shamed into silence.
But his story did start to drift a bit over the years, didn't it?
It did, and this is actually fairly common in trauma victims who become public figures. He started claiming continued contact with the beings. He said they gave him telepathic messages about saving the Earth's environment from destruction. He even claimed they gave him a space stone that would physically heat up whatever they were flying nearby.
Yeah, that sounds significantly less credible than the initial police report.
It does muddy the waters a lot. It feels a lot more like the contactee cults of the 1950s. But serious researchers argue that his initial 1973 testimony stands completely apart from his later psychological processing of the event. He might have just been trying to make sense of the profound trauma by giving it a higher noble purpose.
And then there's Calvin Parker. He took a totally different path.
Calvin went the complete other way. He was just a kid. The event effectively ruined his early adulthood. He suffered a severe nervous breakdown. He was hospitalized multiple times. For decades, he moved from town to town, constantly changing jobs, just trying to outrun the label of being the UFO guy. He became a total recluse.
It took him, what, 40 years to finally tell his side of the story?
Yes. He stayed completely silent until just a few years before his death. He finally wrote a book, not for fame or money, but because he said he simply wanted to correct the historical record before he died. He wanted to finally get the massive burden off his chest. The fact that he ran away from the fame for 40 years strongly suggests he wasn't in it for the attention.
That divergence is so telling to me. One fights to control the narrative, the other just collapses under the weight of it. But both reactions feel incredibly, deeply human.
They do. And I think that's exactly why this case endures today. Whether you believe they met robotic scouts from Zeta Reticuli or experienced some unprecedented psychological break, the effect on their actual lives was undeniably real.
So over 50 years later, where does the Pascagoula case stand in the overall hierarchy of the unexplained?
It's got to be near the very top. You have the completely unique nature of the beings of mechanical robots, which completely defies the cultural expectations of the time. You have the secret tape, which captures raw, unfaked terror in real time. And you have two blue-collar men who, despite intense public ridicule, mental health struggles, and immense pressure to just recant, took the core truth of that night to their graves.
They never backed down on the main facts of what happened to them.
Never once.
I really want to leave you with a final thought about that secret tape again. We live in an era of constant performance today. Everyone is curating their life for an audience. We are so used to people acting. But try to really imagine the headspace of 1973. There's no internet, no viral fame to chase. You are locked in a dark room, terrified that your sanity is actively slipping away. If you were faking it, would you weep? Would you pray out loud for salvation? Or is that the sound of a reality that has been completely shattered?
It's a profound question, and it's one that makes it very hard to sleep at night after studying this case.
If you have the stomach for it, I highly encourage you to search for the Pascagoula alien sketches. Look for those carrot-headed robots. It's an image you definitely won't forget anytime soon. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Keep watching the skies.